At dawn, while the rain still clung to the earth, they led her into the mud, a young mother still bleeding from birth, shamed and cast aside by her own kin. The crowd came to mock, not to save. But one scarred rancher raised his hand, and with that single act, her life was spared. The dawn broke heavy with rain, the kind that sank into the earth and left the main street of the frontier town thick with mud. Wagons rattled in through the pale wash of daylight, their wheels groaning over stones, their horses steaming in the damp chill. The square began to fill with men in long coats, their hats low against the drizzle, rifles slung casual but present at their sides. The air smelled of wet leather and wood smoke, a mingling of life and decay that seemed to belong to this place. From one wagon a figure was led down, a young woman, no more than 20, pale against the gray light. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, soaked through, her braid trailing damp across her back. Each step seemed uncertain, her legs still weakened by the ordeal she had been forced to endure. At her side, she pressed a blood-stained cloth, the last evidence of her body's suffering. The child she had birthed only hours ago was not with her. He had been taken from her arms by the very kin who now delivered her to this moment. The murmurs began at once. Men spat into the mud. Women gathered under eaves whispered behind shawls. Still bleeding and already at auction, someone muttered. Another chuckled. A cursed one, that girl. Brings nothing but shame. Their words fell on her like stones. She did not raise her eyes. She had learned already that to look up was to invite cruelty. The auctioneer's voice cracked the morning stillness, loud and sharp as the crack of a whip. He stood on a wooden crate, coat flapping, hat dripping with rain. "We'll start with the girl," he barked. "Strong enough, young enough. She can serve, if she can keep herself alive." He gestured to her as if she were nothing more than cattle. The crowd shifted, boots sucking in the mud, eyes gleaming with a mix of hunger and disdain. She swayed slightly where she stood, the world tilting. Her body had not yet recovered. She felt hollow, as though half of her had been carved away. In her mind, she still heard the faint cry of her newborn, still saw the rough hands that carried him off. Her kin had told her she was unfit, cursed, a burden too heavy to bear. Better to sell her than to keep her shame under their roof. The bidding began. It was half-hearted, almost mocking. A few coins tossed in as jokes. Laughter followed each. No one wanted her truly, not as a wife, not as a servant. She was too frail, too broken. The rain came harder, plastering her braid to her back, washing the blood from her cloth into faint streaks down her dress. She stood still, shivering, the shawl clinging to her like a second skin, unable to protect her from the weight of their judgment. Then it happened. A voice did not rise, but a hand lifted, silent, deliberate. A man stood at the edge of the square, gray at the temples, his coat worn, his boots caked in the same dust and mud as the rest. He bore a scar along his jaw, a mark that told of old violence. He did not speak. He merely looked at her, then raised his hand higher. The square grew quiet. The auctioneer blinked, surprised, then struck the gavel down with a sharp crack. "Sold." The mutters erupted at once. "Why him? What's he want with a cursed one? A fool's purchase." Men shook their heads. Women pulled their shawls tighter. The scarred man stepped forward through the rain, his eyes never leaving her. She tried to lift her chin, but her strength faltered. He reached her without a word. His hands, scarred and weathered, did not grab her like the others had. He simply extended an arm, steady as a post. When she did not move, he shifted his coat around her shoulders, pulling the heavy wool over her shawl. It was warm, smelling faintly of smoke and horses. For the first time that morning, she felt shielded from the eyes around her. He helped her onto his horse, lifting her gently, as though he feared she might break beneath his touch. She sat stiff, clutching the saddle horn, her body trembling. He swung up behind her with practiced ease, guiding the reins without a glance back at the muttering crowd. The horse stepped forward, hooves sucking in the mud, carrying them slowly out of the square. The rain fell harder still, washing the town into a blur. She did not look back at the wagon that had brought her, nor at the faces of her kin who had sold her off. The sound of their laughter lingered in her ears, but it was fading, dulled by the rhythm of the horse and the steady presence behind her. The man said nothing as they rode. His silence was not cruel, not mocking. It was a silence, heavy with something else, perhaps grief, perhaps weariness. She could not know. She only knew that for the first time since her body had torn itself open to bring life into the world, she was not being pushed down, not being struck, not being told she was nothing. The rain plastered her hair to her cheek, and tears mingled with it until she could not tell which was which. She drew the coat tighter around herself, feeling its weight as both burden and shield. Her hands clenched the fabric, knuckles white, holding on as though it were the last thing tethering her to life. They rode out of the town square, past shuttered storefronts and the crooked spire of the church, past the graveyard that leaned into the hill. The world around her blurred into gray. Dust and rain, stone and wood, the endless plains beyond. And in that moment, despite the blood still staining her, despite the emptiness in her arms, despite the shame pressed upon her by every voice she had ever known, something flickered, not hope, not yet. But the faintest spark of dignity, the kind that cannot be bought or sold, the kind that rises when one soul chooses to see another not as chattel, not as shame, but as human. The rain fell, the road stretched out before them, and the scarred rancher rode on in silence, his cloak around her shoulders, his presence a wordless vow. The ranch sat low against the horizon, a dark outline of wood and stone beneath the heavy skies. The rain had lessened by the time they arrived, but the air still clung damp against the skin, and the land smelled of sage and wet earth. His cabin stood alone, its timbers weathered, its shutters rattling with each restless gust of wind. Beyond it stretched the fence lines, crooked and stubborn, and further still the hills that seemed to swallow all sound. Inside, the silence pressed close. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of lives once lived here, of voices that no longer spoke. The air smelled of coffee grounds long since boiled, of firewood freshly split, of smoke lingering in the walls. A rocking chair stood near the hearth, its motion faint whenever the wind caught the cabin, creaking like a ghost in the dark. He set about tending to the fire, his movements steady and practiced. He did not speak to her, nor did he demand anything. He merely placed her by the hearth, spreading a blanket over her shoulders, then busied himself with the ordinary labor of survival, bringing in wood, hanging his coat, laying tools aside. His boots moved across the floor with the weight of a man accustomed to solitude. She sat on the edge of the hearthstone, staring into the flames. Her body ached still, her bones tender, her breath shallow when she leaned too far forward. The dew, warmth of the fire licked at her skin, but inside she felt only hollow. The memory gnawed without pause. The cry of her newborn, sharp and weak. The rough hands that tore the child from her arms. The voices of her kin, calling her cursed, unfit, a burden too heavy to be kept. Her braid, once tight, loosened as the night wore on. Strands fell around her face, sticking to her damp skin. She remembered the sting of her father's hand across her cheek, the words he spat when he saw she had borne another girl. Girls bring ruin. Girls are curses. Girls don't carry on a man's name. The words had pressed into her bones deeper than the bruise. She could feel them now, echoing louder in this silence than they ever had before. The fire cracked. Sparks leapt, faded. The rocking chair creaked when the wind pressed against the wall. She turned her head toward it and found herself staring. The chair was unfinished, its arms rough, its legs uneven, the wood unpolished. Yet it bore the shape of care, the intention of hands that had once meant to finish it. It looked abandoned, half forgotten yet still waiting. When her gaze shifted, she caught sight of him through the small window as he moved about the yard. His figure was a dark silhouette against the fading light, mending a section of fence. His shoulders bent but steady. He worked in silence as though the world asked nothing of him but endurance. His scarred hands, visible even from a distance, carried their own story. Knuckles rough, skin split, fingers that had known the weight of both rope and rifle. Behind the barn stood a grave. She noticed it when the clouds parted enough to spill moonlight across the yard. The wood of the cross leaned slightly, its surface grayed by years of weather. No flowers, no fresh earth, only the silent mark of someone lost and remembered in solitude. She understood then, without needing to ask. He had been left behind, too. When he returned inside, he lit a lantern and set it on the table. Its glow filled the corners with a fragile warmth. He sharpened a knife slowly, the scrape against the whetstone rhythmic, steady, almost soothing. He did not intrude upon her grief, nor did he offer words. Words could wound as easily as they could mend. He seemed to know this. She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked again at the rocking chair. It seemed to her like a symbol of all that had been taken, the child she no longer held, the life denied before it had begun. Yet it also seemed like a question, a fragile promise, as if it waited still for someone to finish what had been abandoned. Her thoughts drifted, carried by the firelight and the creak of the chair. She wondered if the grave by the barn had once belonged to a woman who too had sat here with her hair undone, with her body aching, with her heart hollow from loss. Perhaps the chair had been meant for a child who never came, or who came only long enough to leave again. The unfinished wood seemed to hum with all the untold stories of this place. When the night deepened, she lay down near the fire, curling beneath the blanket. The floorboards beneath her were cold, but the warmth of the hearth softened it. He moved quietly, setting another log on the fire, then sat at the table in the lantern glow. His scarred hand rested for a long time against the wood, his eyes distant. Two souls beneath one roof, both haunted, both carrying the weight of graves and absences. The silence between them was not empty, though. It was heavy, full of memory, full of shadows. Yet within it lay the faintest thread of something else, something neither of them dared to name. She closed her eyes, the rocking chair creaking faintly in the wind. She thought of her baby, somewhere far, perhaps already gone. Her arms ached with the absence. Tears slid silently into her hair, yet the fire's warmth touched her skin, and she felt, if only for a moment, that survival was still possible. Tone and realization. The night settled heavy with ghosts, but not unbearable ones. Shadows crept through her mind and his, yet in the glow of the fire and the creak of the unfinished chair, there was a fragile promise, survival, if not yet healing. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. By dusk, the sky was already heavy with bruised clouds, rolling low across the plains like beasts preparing to strike. The rancher paused in the yard, lifting his face to the wind, the weight of it promising trouble. He moved quickly then, gathering what needed shelter, urging the horses into the barn, his scarred hands quick despite their stiffness. She stood at the window of the cabin, watching the horizon swallow the last of the light. Her shawl clung at her shoulders, though the cabin fire still burned. The wind moaned through the fence posts, and the first rattle of shutters broke the quiet. When he stepped back inside, arms laden with damp wood, she startled at the slam of the door against the storm's push. "Come," he said simply, his voice the low rasp of a man who spoke rarely. He gestured toward the remaining woodpile outside. Without words, she pulled her braid over one shoulder, wrapped her shawl tighter, and followed him out. The rain struck like needles, cold and merciless, soaking them before they crossed the yard. Together they bent to the pile, their hands brushing once in the dark, lightning flashing her profile against the sky. In that white blaze, her face looked carved from both fragility and defiance, her eyes shadowed but steady. By the time the shutters clattered shut and the last logs thudded near the hearth, the storm had fully claimed the plains. Thunder rolled like the judgment of heaven itself, shaking the cabin's bones. The wind pressed drafts through every crack, rattling crockery and sending sparks from the fire. She knelt near the hearth, feeding the flames, her hair coming loose, again as rainwater traced her cheek. Then came the sound of hooves, at first faint against the storm's roar, then clearer, a single rider pressing through the tempest. She stiffened, heart racing. He lifted his rifle from its place above the door, though his manner was calm, not hurried. She backed against the wall, clutching the edge of the shawl at her throat. The door swung open to a figure dripping with rain. A tall man, hair dark as the storm, eyes sharp but steady. His coat was soaked through, his face marked by lines of hardship, yet his presence was not threatening. The rancher lowered his rifle at once, giving a slight nod. The man returned it, saying nothing until the door was barred and the storm shut out behind him. He was no stranger. A native ally of the rancher, bound not by words but by an old debt. A moment long passed when one life had saved another. The woman sensed it in their silence, the kind of trust forged not in talk but in shared blood and fire. The newcomer shook the water from his coat, then sat by the hearth without ceremony. At last his voice broke the storm's roar. "Your kin look for her." His words were quiet, but heavy. Not to take her home, to end the shame. Her chest, constricted. The fire blurred before her eyes as memory surged, the hard faces of her father and brothers, the words of scorn, the rough hands tearing her child away. She felt the same terror now, the same hollow ache. Her arms wrapped around herself as though to shield what could no longer be shielded. The rancher did not move, though his jaw tightened. His scar caught the firelight, an old mark of violence. He set another log on the fire, the crack of it sharp, decisive. Then he poured coffee into 3 tin cups, his hands steady even as the storm rattled the cabin. They drank in silence, the fire casting their faces into shifting light. She watched the 2 men across the small room. One, scarred by loss but steady in his solitude. The other, a shadow carved by hardship. His words few, but his presence loyal. Between them was no barrier of blood, no mockery of difference. There was only the silent weight of respect built through acts, not speeches. The storm beat at the walls, thunder rolling like distant cannon fire. Yet inside, the fire burned steady, and the 3 of them shared its warmth. She sat near the window, rewinding her braid with trembling fingers, her hair damp against her palms. Each twist of the braid steadied her. Each knot bound her together again. She looked at them then, not as men to fear, but as proofs that dignity could still exist in a world that had stripped her of it. For the first time since her child's cry was silenced, she felt the faintest easing of her aloneness. Outside, the storm cleansed the land, rain carving rivulets through dust, thunder splitting the air. Inside, the shadows lengthened, but the fire held. She breathed slowly, her chest still tight but her heart no longer hollow. For the first time, the silence felt shared, not crushing. Tone and realization, suspense and intimacy interwove. The storm mirrored her turmoil, but within its fury she found proof of unexpected bonds. The thunder was judgment, the fire fragile safety, and the braid she rewound by the window a symbol of her gathering strength, her refusal to break again. The storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind was not gentle. It was heavy, as if the land itself held its breath. The hills glistened with rainwater, the creek ran swift and swollen, and the air smelled of wet cedar. But within the cabin, silence thickened like smoke, curling into corners, pressing into her chest. At night, when the fire burned low, she listened to the floorboards sigh and settle as though the house remembered every footstep that had crossed it before her. The kettle hissed even when empty, echoing in the dark, and the rocking chair swayed faintly when the wind leaned against the walls, creaking in a rhythm that unsettled her. She wondered if it had rocked long ago for someone who once sat here, with a babe in her arms, and if its sound now was meant for ghosts. The rancher moved through these nights with a patience that unnerved her. He did not crowd her, nor did he demand words. He set his rifle above the hearth, always within reach, a reminder that danger still waited beyond their walls. She felt safe in that, yet at times his silent watchfulness felt like a weight too, great to carry. She had not known such protection before, and the unfamiliarity of it pressed harder than cruelty ever had. During the days she tried to keep her hands busy, though her body still betrayed her. She swept the hearth, mended a shirt with clumsy stitches and folded linens until her fingers shook. Once, when she found herself holding one of his wife's old shawls, she froze. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, as if the woman's presence lingered there. She laid it back carefully as though touching it too long was trespass. At dusk he returned from the fields, boots carrying mud, hands scarred by rope and axe. He ate in silence and she across from him. Sometimes she watched him from the corner of her eye, the way his shoulders slumped with fatigue, the way he bowed his head slightly over the table, as though habit had taught him to make himself smaller, when another shared the room. His grief was different from hers, but it lived in the same silence, and it frightened her. Not the grief, but the possibility that she might begin to depend on it. On him, on his wordless kindness. Dependence had never been safe for her. In her father's house, kindness had always come with a blow afterward, or with a debt she could never repay. Even in moments when she saw no judgment in the rancher's eyes, fear ran like ice through her veins. One evening, the air felt too tight to breathe. The storm had left a raw chill in the nights, and she wrapped herself in the quilt she had found folded at the end of the bed. Its weight was different from the others. Softer, older, the stitching careful and delicate. She realized as her fingers traced the seams that it was not hers to hold. It belonged to the woman who had once kept this house, who had stitched it in evenings by firelight, whose hands had left their memory in the thread. The rancher entered quietly, the door closing with a soft thud against the frame. He set his hat on the peg and glanced at her. She stood there, the quilt held in her hands, her braid loose and falling across her shoulder. The silence between them thickened. Her throat tightened, but the question burned too fiercely to hold back. Why? Her voice was hoarse, almost breaking. She pressed her hands against the quilt as though it could steady her. Why did you buy me? The room seemed to still. The fire cracked once, sending sparks upward. He did not answer at once. He moved to the hearth, crouched, and set another log upon the flames. Only when the fire rose did he straighten and look at her fully. Because no one else would let you live, he said. The words were simple, unadorned, but they cut sharper than cruelty ever had. They burned with both salvation and sorrow, a truth so plain, it stripped her bare. Her breath caught, and she felt both anger and relief twist within her. To live, was that all? Not to be wanted, not to be cherished, only to be spared? Yet beneath the sting lay something steadier. He had not bought her to own her. He had bought her so she might draw breath another day. That alone, in this world, was more mercy than she had ever known. She lowered her eyes, clutching the quilt, tighter. Its fabric smelled of cedar and smoke, of another woman's life folded away. She thought of the grave behind the barn, the unfinished rocking chair by the wall, the rifle above the hearth. This house was built upon absences, yet it still stood. Perhaps she too might stand a while longer within it. The silence returned, but it was changed. It was no longer empty nor crushing. It carried the weight of words spoken plainly, of grief shared without explanation. Neither of them was ready to cross the chasm that yawned between their pasts, but for the first time she believed a bridge might one day be built. That night, when the floorboards creaked and the rocking chair swayed in the wind, she listened, differently. The sounds no longer spoke of ghosts alone. They spoke of endurance, of lives carried forward one breath at a time. She lay beneath the quilt, eyes open to the rafters, and though sorrow still pressed hard against her chest, she no longer felt entirely alone. Tone and realization. The quiet after the storm revealed the ache of confinement, but also the fragile thread of trust forming between two haunted souls. The rocking chair remained both ghost and promise, the rifle a reminder of danger, and the quilt a bridge of survival stitched with loss and mercy. The dusk came down thick, a bruised sky settling low across the hills. The day's heat lingered, pressing close, but the air carried a weight that had nothing to do with weather. She felt it first as unease, the kind that prickled her skin and made her eyes turn again and again to the window. The rancher must have sensed it too, for he stood longer than usual in the yard, his shoulders squared, gaze fixed on the horizon where dust rose faint against the fading light. When the riders appeared, her breath caught. 3, then 5, their shapes growing clearer as they drew closer, horses lathered, faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. She knew them. Kin by blood, yet strangers in every other way. Their mouths had spit the words that marked her cursed, their hands had torn her child from her arms. Now they rode to claim what they had cast aside, not to welcome her back, but to erase the shame she carried in their name. She stood in the doorway, her shawl clutched tight. The rancher stepped into the yard, rifle balanced easily in his scarred hands. He did not shout, did not posture. He simply stood, his presence steady as the barn behind him, the distance between them and him filled with a silence sharper than any insult. One of the riders spat into the dust. "She's ours," he barked, voice carrying above the restless shifting of hooves. "You've no right to her." The rancher did not move. His scar caught the last of the light, a pale mark against weathered skin. "You sold her," he said quietly. "That ended your claim." Laughter rang, cruel and hollow. "You think to keep her? She'll bring you nothing but ruin." Another shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "Best step aside, old man. This ain't worth dying over." But to her, watching from the doorway, it was worth dying over. For the first time in her life, someone stood between her and the men who called her worthless. The air itself seemed to hum, crackling like firewood just before it split. Gun oil, sweat, and fear mingled in the stillness. Then came the first shot. It split the air like thunder, the crack echoing across the yard. Horses reared, men shouted, dust rose. The rancher's rifle barked in reply, precise, unhurried. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her body trembling as chaos erupted before her. And then from the tree line, another figure broke forth, the native ally, riding hard, rifle already raised. His shot drove one of the riders back, forcing the others into disorder. In moments the odds shifted, balance restored not by words but by the bond of men who had long since learned to trust each other's steel. The fight was brief, a storm that flared hot and was gone. 2 men fled wounded. Another clutched his arm, as his horse carried him stumbling into the dark. The rest scattered, swallowed by the dust they themselves had raised. Silence fell hard in their wake, broken only by the horses' labored breaths and the slow settling of hooves into earth. She did not think, only moved. Her feet carried her from the doorway into the yard, skirts damp with dust, hair falling loose from her braid. She reached him where he stood, rifle still warm in his hands, his chest rising and falling slow but steady. Her fingers caught his arm, trembling so fiercely she could hardly grip him. Tears blurred her vision, running hot and unchecked down her cheeks. For the first time since the birth, she wept not from shame but from release. Release of fear held too long, of grief carried alone. Her forehead bent near his shoulder, her shawl dampened with dust and tears. He did not move away. His hand, scarred and rough, came to rest lightly against her back, not possessive, not demanding, only steady. A presence she could lean against. The native ally lingered at the edge of the yard, his horse stamping restlessly. He met the rancher's gaze, a nod passing between them. No words. None were needed. Then he turned his horse and vanished again into the dark, leaving only the sound of the night insects rising where violence had just roared. They returned inside as the last of the light gave way to stars. She sat by the hearth, her hands still, shaking as she reached for the kettle. He set his rifle back above the mantel, the barrel gleaming faintly in the firelight. The chair creaked when he lowered himself into it, shoulders heavy, face unreadable. She poured the coffee with unsteady fingers, spilling a little onto the table. He said nothing of it, only took the cup when she placed it before him. The silence, stretched, but it was changed. It no longer felt like a wall. It felt like something shared, like a breath held together, The fire cracked, sparks leaping into the dim. She drew her shawl close, watching the flames. Her tears had left her hollow, but in that hollow, there was space for something new. Not yet hope, not yet joy, but recognition. She was not alone in her fight, not anymore. Across the table, his eyes met hers. The firelight caught the scar along his jaw, the lines carved deep by years of solitude. He looked at her not as a burden, not as a shame, but as a life worth guarding. She did not look away this time. Tone and realization. The violence had been swift, its cost carried in silence, but its weight lingered. The fire symbolized more than warmth now. It was the line drawn between danger and safety, between loneliness and recognition. What passed between them was not spoken, but it burned steady, the first sparks of something unspoken yet powerful. The dawn broke pale, the horizon washed in a silver light that softened the edges of the hills. The land was quiet, as though the night's violence had been swallowed whole by the earth. The cabin stood still, smoke drifting from the chimney, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. He saddled the horse without a word. His movements were practiced, steady. Each leather strap pulled tight, each buckle checked as though the ritual itself was a prayer. She stepped from the doorway, her shawl wrapped close against the morning chill. Her braid brushed her shoulder, heavy with dew. For a long moment she stood, uncertain, until he reached down and offered his hand. She placed hers in his, trembling, but firm, and mounted behind him. They carried nothing with them, no bags, no tools, no burden of possessions. Only the silence of two lives scarred and reshaped, bound now by something deeper than words. As the horse moved forward, her arms found their place around his waist. Her cheek rested briefly against his back, and she let the rhythm of the ride steady her breath. The road stretched out beneath them, damp with last night's rain. When they reached the town, shutters were already opening, the day beginning. Faces appeared in windows. Voices rose in whispers. The woman once mocked for her weakness now rode behind a man who neither boasted nor explained. The people watched, their judgments heavy, but the rancher's silence deflected them all. He did not glance their way. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed forward. She felt the weight of their stares but did not lower her head. The shawl clung to her, her braid swayed against her shoulder, and though her heart thudded hard, she held herself upright. For once, shame did not bend her spine. They did not stop in town. Their path turned instead toward the hill where the graveyard lay. The grass was long there, bending in the morning breeze. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, weathered by rain and sun, names carved with unsteady hands. Among them lay a small patch of earth without sign or marker. She dismounted slowly, her knees weak. He tied the reins loosely to a post and lifted a bundle from the saddle. A wooden cross he had carved by lamplight, its surface plain, its shape unadorned but true. She reached for it, her fingers brushing his scarred hands. Together, they carried it to the bare mound. Her hands trembled as she knelt in the grass. He steadied her, lowering the cross into the soil. She pressed her palm against the wood, guiding his roughened hand to join hers. Their fingers overlapped, scar against softness, grief meeting grief. The act was simple, reverent, final. Tears slid down her cheeks, not with the wild force of despair, but with the slow release of something long held. She whispered nothing. Words would not have borne the weight of it. The silence itself became the prayer. He stood beside her, his shadow long across the grass. For the first time since she had come into his life, he bowed his head. Not in pity, not in apology, but in respect. For her loss, for the child, for the strength it took to kneel here and not collapse into dust. When the cross stood firm, she sat back on her heels, shawl slipping from her shoulders. The morning sun caught the loose strands of her hair, turning them gold. She felt the ache in her body, the hollow in her arms, but also a strange stillness in her chest. She was no longer nameless grief. She was a mother who had marked her child's place in the world. He reached down, offering his hand once more. She took it, rising with unsteady steps. Their eyes met, and in his gaze she found no promise of love, no easy balm for the wounds they carried. What she found instead was something rarer, the assurance that she would not be cast aside again. They returned to the horse. She mounted behind him, her shawl gathered, her braid falling forward now across her chest like a banner reclaimed. When the horse moved on, dust rose behind them, curling into the morning light. The ride home was quiet, but it was not empty. It was the silence of survival, of a future no longer condemned to loneliness. She held herself straighter, the quilt of grief still wrapped around her but no longer suffocating. He rode steady, his back strong against her cheek, carrying them both forward without question. As the cabin came into view, its smoke curling once more into the air, she drew a deep breath. This place, weathered and scarred like the man himself, was no longer only a stranger's shelter. It was where her life would begin again, not in joy, not yet, but in dignity. The reckoning was complete. Not revenge, not triumph, but a quiet restoration. And as the dust settled behind them, the land itself seemed to breathe again, carrying the promise of second chances. Tone and realization, poetic and redemptive. The reckoning was not one with blood, but with survival. The wooden cross stood as symbol, the dust rising behind the horse as testament, the braid resting forward as sign of transformation. Their silence was no longer isolation, it was the fragile beginning of something that could grow.